This is really, when I took over chairman in January 2015, it was in March 2015 that it was revealed that Hillary Clinton ran most of her emails through a private server. Not only is this committee the General Oversight Committee of Congress, we have specific legislative jurisdiction on federal records. So that really began my work and this committee's work for the last 6 years investigating some of this corruption in the Obama administration. I think it's important that, to note that this represents, from my standpoint, the unequal application of justice. Hillary Clinton was exonerated. The email scandal, the mid-year examination investigation, morphed into the Crossfire Hurricane scandal. And I just want to talk about one of the texts that Peter Strzok texted to Lisa Page shortly after they exonerated Hillary Clinton. He said, "And damn, this feels momentous." Now he's talking about Crossfire Hurricane, because this matters. The other one did too, the mid-year exam, but that was just to ensure we didn't F something up. This matters because it matters. So super glad to be on this voyage with you. And yet we had the Inspector General, when he reviewed the FISA abuse in his report, claimed that there was no proof that political bias affected any actions. I would challenge that statement. The final one I want to talk about is what we uncovered in our July 2017 report on leaks. And the overall summary of that is that report showed 125 leaks in the first 126 days of the Trump administration. 62 of them would have been defined as harming national security, according to the Obama administration's definition of that. And that 62 compares with, I think, 8 or 9 during both the Bush and the Obama administrations. Just an explosion of leaks. And by the way, those leaks are what drove and sustained the false narrative of Russian collusion with the Trump campaign. Those proven totally false, but was the center of the Crossfire Hurricane investigation, and then a special counsel, and quite honestly morphed into an impeachment trial here in the Senate branch. I mean, I find it shocking that within 2 weeks of President Trump entering office, 2 of his phone calls to world leaders were leaked to the press. This is unprecedented. It's actually what spawned our investigation into the leaks, to show the 125 leaks in the first 126 days. This cannot go on. This is dangerous to our democratic republic. Unfortunately, my efforts to uncover the truth have been severely obstructed by the agencies involved, by entrenched bureaucrats that have every incentive to keep it hidden. This has been true during both the Obama and Trump administrations. For example, the FBI did not meaningfully produce records about the Crossfire Hurricane investigation until I subpoenaed them in August of this year. And even then, documents are heavily redacted. And I've just got a quick example of this. This is an email that the GSA produced to us, and you can see we can read the whole thing except for the mobile phone number of the sender of the email. This is the exact same email produced to us by the FBI. As you can see, almost everything is redacted. There's no reason for things to be redacted. There's nothing involving or harming national security here. Might embarrass the agency, but doesn't harm national security. This is what we've been dealing with. This is the resistance we have encountered in our investigations into abuse of power. To help place these scandals in perspective, we're also going to release new documents we've obtained related to the Crossfire Hurricane investigation, and also to demonstrate how much has been withheld and how many questions remain unanswered.
Today's hearing seeks to rehash the same matter in a more partisan way, to reach conclusions that the chairman has already announced publicly. There was no plot against President Trump when he won the election 4 years ago, or when he lost the election last month. Promoting a demonstrably false narrative with dangerous rhetoric erodes trust and prevents our country from healing. We simply don't have time to indulge in hyper-partisan investigations that simply don't advance the interests of the American people. Therefore, I do not think today's hearing is an appropriate use of our committee's time, resources, or, quite frankly, credibility.
I've been a nonpartisan journalist for nearly 40 years in local news, CNN, CBS, PBS, and the national station group Sinclair. I've witnessed a dramatic devolution in my industry as we've allowed ourselves to be transformed into tools of political and corporate interests, pushing narratives, slanting information on the news and online, and seeking to shape public opinion rather than report facts and various views. This means today's media landscape has allowed some of the biggest and most important stories of our time to be covered in a fantastical and one-sided, often inaccurate and incomplete way, or perhaps escape coverage entirely, while important violations of law and constitutional rights by powerful interests go unchallenged. We have to confront the fact that our intelligence structure and some inside our federal agencies have proven more powerful than Congress, the legislative or judicial branches, more influential with the media, and largely immune from oversight, and after the most egregious violations from prosecution. Even the President of the United States, whoever it may be, plays second fiddle to this structure, and partly because the news media has dropped the ball, these players are unaccountable, operating in an extra-constitutional fashion that persists from administration to administration, meaning this is not a partisan issue. Just one example can be found in the government spying on journalists and other innocent Americans. After an incredible series of revelations beginning in 2013, nobody was held accountable. CBS, where I worked at the time, publicly announced in 2013 that forensics proved my computers were remotely hacked and my work remotely monitored, and the CBS News systems were accessed in the spy effort as well. After the forensics definitively proved the government was responsible, had secretly installed a keystroke monitoring program, exfiltrated files, listened in on me secretly activating audio, looked through my work photos, then remotely overwrote computer logs to try to erase their tracks when we discovered them, nothing happened, zero. To this day, I'm still suing in civil court, trying to force the Justice Department to reveal the names of all the specific agents involved and, so I thought at one point, force accountability and stop it from happening to others. But 7 long years later, it's an uphill battle as the Justice Department defends the guilty agents using taxpayer dollars. Among many, there's a lack of trust in Congress, the media, health officials, the Justice Department, and our elections process. Now, even when Congress may be doing the public good, the media may be telling the truth, health officials may be giving good advice, the Department of Justice may be doing the right thing, or the elections aren't fraudulent, many don't buy the story we're telling. We've created this environment over a period of decades, and then we look at the public, which watches the double standards whipsawed between the alternate realities presented by the media, and we ask why they're mistrustful as if it's their doing when it's ours. And if we're unable to change things, we can only expect more of the same or worse.
During my nearly 24-year career in the FBI, I investigated and managed numerous significant counterintelligence cases and specifically Russian counterintelligence investigations. I have been speaking up at some personal risk, not for political reasons, but rather out of my concern that the integrity of the FBI and the trust that the American people have traditionally placed in the FBI have been imperiled by the faulty and reckless actions of those former FBI leaders. Let me be as clear as possible. These disgraced former FBI executives never should have opened the Crossfire Hurricane investigation. They did not, despite the DOJ Inspector General's subsequent comments to the contrary, have adequate predication for starting an intrusive investigation of U.S. citizens.
Nearly 4 years ago, a series of crimes were committed in full view of the public, and to date, no one has been charged. It was the one set of crimes inarguably committed during the course of Crossfire Hurricane, the FBI's investigation of Russian interference in the 2016 election and the possible involvement of the Trump campaign. For General Flynn, it was the beginning of a twisted journey forced upon him by political opponents and professional rivals, and ending only last week with a presidential pardon. For America, those leaks are the centerpiece of one of the most remarkable crime sprees in our history. Classified information leaked serially to prestige press organizations for the purpose of prosecuting a campaign of political warfare against a sitting president. Reporters rarely, if ever, actually saw the classified documents. They relied on badly spun accounts of the documents fed to them by a circle of intelligence leakers. The classified information was used to advance the narrative that Trump had been compromised by Russian spies. U.S. officials knew not only that they were breaking the law, they also knew they were marketing a lie, and they knew where it originated. It was to lend more color and weight to the Russia smear targeting Trump that government officials leaked classified information like the Flynn intercept. None have ever been charged. The press itself was honored. The Washington Post and New York Times were awarded a joint Pulitzer Prize for their numerous stories sourced to classified information leaked to advance a fraudulent narrative. Because of its part in pushing Russiagate, American intelligence services and law enforcement authorities are regarded with skepticism, if not contempt, by half of the U.S. public. Programs like Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrants, confidential human sources, and classified intelligence designed to keep citizens safe from terrorism, organized crime, and adversarial states were turned against Americans who were simply practicing their right to participate in our political process.
You have the intelligence community actually knowing that it's Hillary Clinton approving of a plan to stir up this scandal, tying candidate Trump to Russian collusion. That kind of explains the whole Steele dossier, doesn't it? And the FBI knew that that was bought and paid for by the Hillary Clinton campaign. The FBI knew that the primary subsource of that Steele dossier had been investigated by them in 2009. They knew all of this for sure by the end of January 2017.
One of the most puzzling aspects of this whole, it really is kind of a national tragedy. It's a tragedy for the FBI, certainly, as we look back and see the thin basis for launching an investigation like this. When you juxtapose the reasons that the FBI stated in their opening communication for starting up a case, and then their comments to the Inspector General later as to why they felt they were compelled to investigate the Trump campaign, they don't add up with a certain logic that should have been applied to the dossier and its connection to the Clinton campaign.
There really has been, and there is, an unholy alliance between liberals, Democrats, and the media. There is completely unequal treatment by the media, most of the media, Democrat versus Republican.
One of the things I've criticized is that at the beginning of the Trump administration, many news organizations announced that they were suspending their normal ethics and standards that dictate how their news organization typically deals with things such as use of anonymous sources, that they were suspending these because they said they needed to suspend their standards to cover a uniquely dangerous president. And I've argued, and I think you've observed, that I actually think there's no more important time for us to keep our standards and ethics than when we're covering somebody that maybe we don't like or we have strong feelings about. That's what standards are for. And instead, we saw this lifting starting in the 2016 time period and this changing of everything, the way we used to cover things. And at CBS News, there were very strict rules we went by to use anonymous sources as a last resort and only with very certain and specific caveats and disclosures. All that has changed.
I come from the left. I'm familiar with left-wing bias. What we've seen the last several years has nothing to do with left-wing bias. This is not about partisanship. What we've seen is something very destructive and very dangerous. What we're talking about now is not a normal media. It is a platform for information operations. It's not just about partisanship.
What should be done to an entity or an agency to hold them to account? Because they were never held to account for literally intimidating the press and for tracking the press and for investigating journalists through this process, tapping cell phones and such.
At a minimum, one would think there would be an apology, and the people who took part in these actions would no longer be in a position that they could ever work in the government again and do these types of things. But people see that nothing happened to them. Why should anybody change the way they operate? In my case, this was illegal action, so obviously they should be prosecuted. But who's the prosecutorial authority? the Department of Justice and FBI, who are the ones implicated. And since they're not going to do the job, you have somebody like me, just a citizen, trying to bring a case in court to force what the Department of Justice is supposed to do criminally, because they're not. And then they spend all this taxpayer money just dragging it out, fighting it, trying to get the court to dismiss the case. I think because there's no accountability time and time again, they may say, oh, people need more training, we'll reiterate our policies. This has happened over and over again. And they know, again, from administration to administration, some of the same people, nothing ever happens to them. So the behavior doesn't change.
This is not the FBI I knew or worked in. This is not the FBI agents who work tirelessly, and analysts and other support personnel who work tirelessly every day for the good reasons that the FBI exists. This was a hijacking of the FBI, given respect to the Inspector General's conclusion of no bias. It's clear that there was bias involved by the text messages that were written by Peter Strzok and Lisa Page. It's clear by the statements made by former Director Comey and Deputy Director McCabe that they held a personal animus toward the president. There's no dispute on that. So this investigation was clearly a malicious undertaking.
Yeah, the struggle that I have is I know a lot of great FBI agents that they're frustrated, disappointed, and quite frankly embarrassed for how leadership handled some of these investigations. They don't do it this way, and their statement over and over to me is, if I did as a line agent what James Comey did as a leader, I would have been fired and should have been fired. But they seem to be held to a different account than what leadership is being held to account in this.
I want to thank you, Senator Langford, Senator Scott. I think Senator Hawley's on by remote for attending this. I think this is part of the problem. I think you all understand that I've not gotten a great deal of support for these investigations over the last 6 years. I think the attendance of this hearing shows that. Now, Congress is a paper tiger. The reason these people aren't held accountable is there's no way to hold them accountable. Who investigates the investigator? Who prosecutes the prosecutors? That is an enormous problem. And it's certainly what I've come to understand in the 6 years trying to do this, trying to get this out. Obviously, the bias in the media, the attacks that I've had to put up with. It doesn't bother me personally. It bothers me in terms of the reflection and the impact on our democracy and on our freedoms. This is serious. And yet, we've got a couple senators attending this hearing. And I've got my ranking member saying this isn't even an appropriate hearing for this committee to have. There's the problem. Senator Scott.
How can somebody who believes they're a legitimate journalist like Wolf Blitzer or Jake Tapper not care about this?
Well, I worked at CNN back when it was a news organization back in 1990-93, and we wouldn't have dreamed of covering stories. I spoke to many former CNN insiders in the book that I just wrote. They're all horrified at the turn that this once very prestigious and fairly straight down the middle news organization has taken. And you have to understand, if you realize that the media landscape has now been successfully co-opted and we've invited them in, I say we've been infiltrated by these interests that want to turn us into these mouthpieces, then you understand that when you do that job, you put forth a narrative, even if it proves not to be true, that you are given promotions and attention, and your views are then amplified by the like-minded media and social media, and it feels like you're doing everything right. Your colleagues are patting you on the back, and it just sort of feeds upon itself. But it's evolved into a situation where it's not journalism as certainly as I knew it, and as I think many Americans, if you've been around long enough, thought of journalism. I think it's all being redefined right now and changed.
I mean, have you ever heard of something like this happening? I mean, what does this say about the credibility of the FBI and what they have done in the Crossfire Hurricane case?
This is part of the wake of damage that's been left by these executives, because you're exactly right, Senator. It calls into question every other FBI FISA application for vitally important cases, counterterrorism cases, life and death type of investigations. So it's tremendous damage. I don't think the court was strong enough, frankly, in its condemnation of this activity. The director's own words, Director Comey's own words, that the dossier was salacious and unverified, And then 2 times after uttering those words, he signed off on a FISA application that was, by the FBI's own admission, by their own admission, dependent on that dossier for the probable cause.
You said that you're firmly of the view that there was insufficient evidence to justify opening the Crossfire Hurricane investigation. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Crossfire Hurricane was a case that was opened against U.S. citizens members of a presidential campaign. Unprecedented. Never been done before. You would think it would be handled with care, marked all over that decision-making process, but it doesn't appear that way. So they literally took fourth-hand information. The FBI received information from a friendly foreign government, which we now know to be Australia, who in turn had a conversation with George Papadopoulos, who in turn received information now known through Joseph Mifsud that the Russians had suggested they had information damaging to the Clinton campaign. I'm not sure how you rally all of that together to make sufficient predication for opening even a preliminary investigation, a limited investigation. They went ahead and opened a full investigation, which gave them the ability to use all of the FBI's investigative powers against U.S. citizens. And as I pointed out earlier, not only were they relying on fourth-hand hearsay, embedded in those statements by the Australian diplomat were 2 exculpatory statements that should have stopped the show right then, but didn't.
Right, and we now know that the source, the Steele dossier, which was the principal source for the FISA warrants, and we've heard testimony in the Judiciary Committee that the FISA warrants would not have issued had it not have been for the Steele dossier, and we now know the principal source for that was in fact a Russian agent. I mean, subject to a counterintelligence investigation by the FBI at the time they saw the warrants. I mean, it's just, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, if this were a movie, you'd say, oh, it's totally implausible. And the fact it's actually happened.
Hard to overstate how anomalous this behavior was, that they would, first of all, open up a counterintelligence investigation into a presidential campaign without incredibly substantial justification, let alone thin. And then secondly, to embargo that investigation onto the 7th floor of the FBI and run it out of headquarters. The reason why the FBI runs its investigations in field offices is not in headquarters, because headquarters is close to the political flame of Washington, D.C. They're there for a different purpose. They're not there for an investigative purpose. The field offices handle investigations. That's where the experience is. That's where the sobriety is in making a judgment about whether there's adequate predication under the Attorney General guidelines exists. No, they took this into the 7th floor, out of the director's office, and ran this rogue investigation.
I think it's pretty clear that there was an enormous amount of care taken in opening this investigation, and it was done for political purposes. I think it becomes increasingly clear for all the reasons Mr. Brock has outlined, the violation of procedural norms, the outright lying to the FISA court. This was done very deliberately. It was done by people who did not want Donald Trump to be president, who did not want the 2016 election results to stand, and they tried to weaponize the FBI to interfere in a presidential election. And sadly, they succeeded. And that is going to go down, I think, as one of the great disgraces in American history. And this committee and this Senate needs to make sure it never happens again. Thank you for your work on this, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hawley, first of all, I agree with you. And if you could stick around, I want to break protocol because I actually want to turn you into a witness. But I want to make a point based on what Mr. Brock said, because Mr. Brock, you said it's completely appropriate for the FBI to investigate Russian interference. They knew there was Russian interference going on in the fact that this Clinton campaign, the DNC paid for the Steele dossier, which they knew was Russian disinformation. And I think this shows the jaw-dropping bias and unequal treatment of justice when they continue to pursue the Trump campaign, where they had no evidence, they had exculpatory evidence, and they didn't lift a finger to investigate what was happening with the Steele dossier and the Clinton campaign. But again, I really appreciate you participating in this hearing and caring about it. Didn't have a whole lot of participation. We've had a couple Democrat senators blink on and blink off and not ask any questions, so they're not particularly inquisitive, and that's part of the problem. But I've made this comment a number of times. I've made this point that when it comes to investigations about wrongdoing in the political realm, we do it completely backwards. I mean, take a look at what happened. Take a look at the corruption that we now know about, but how long it took for us to get this level of knowledge of what happened. So I think Congress needs to first investigate, have all the access to all the information, and then if we see potential criminal activity, we refer those cases to the Justice Department. If there's a conflict there, then you set up a special counsel. So we've done this completely backwards, and here we are 4 years later, and we're only now starting to uncover the extent of the corruption. And the corruption is incredibly troubling. It should have troubled every member of Congress, every U.S. senator, every member of this committee, but it obviously doesn't. Because apparently corruption is partisan. If it's corruption in the side of your party, not worried about it. I'm worried about it regardless.
But the nation is craving transparency right now. And I think it's better for the FBI to rip the Band-Aid off, and if there are things that are embarrassing to the FBI that have to be revealed, then let's get it over with. The Bureau has taken a beating over the last 3 or 4 years at the hands of some bad actors. We shouldn't, there's no shame in that. There were some poor decisions made, whether politically biased or not. They were poor decisions that dramatically impacted the American trust in the FBI. So let's restore that.
The impact of Russian interference in our politics and our elections pales in comparison to the impact that Jack Dorsey denies of Twitter, of his censorship, of Facebook's censorship, of the extreme bias in the media.
Because I quoted an international news executive, not by name, but who spoke to me for my last book, who gave a very chilling quote. And he said, because of the fear of being deplatformed by these social media companies and the organized interests coming after you on social media, appearing to generate an AstroTurf campaign against you, this guy said, the newsman in me wants to report the truth, but the businessman in me says, pull your punches, because what sort of Pyrrhic victory would it be to be able to publish something only to be deplatformed and have no outlet at all? So if you can imagine news organizations now withholding what they see as the truth or honest reporting for fear of the big tech companies and social media coming after them or deplatforming them, then you get a sense of how effective this is at managing the news that we see.
As a journalist, the work that you and this committee have done, everything from putting out the Strzok page emails to the Hunter Biden conflict of interest document, it's been extremely important. There's lots of researchers out there, lots of serious journalists who are doing real work, and we thank you for the important and vital work that this committee has done, without which there's just different things we wouldn't know. Really, the amount of research that has gone into your products, I commend you for it and thank you for it.
I mean, our media giants, the people control it, these are American oligarchs. They're American billionaires and moguls, and they exert way too much power that we need to figure out how to rein in.
The problems I track have more to do with outside influences, both political and corporate, understanding the first 2 decades of this century, very clever ways to get their nose under the tent at news organizations and get their people hired and use nonprofits and LLCs and crisis management firms and global law firms to shape what we do effectively and shape the terms of what we talk about, the language we use, the stories we don't report. And then in 2016, after, in my view, they had effectively controlled much of the news landscape, they saw we could still get unfettered access to information online. So they set about in a very organized fashion to attack that source of information as well. That's where we are today.
We're looking at in the media now is not simply about partisanship. They are serving as a platform, as a sword and shield for the oligarchs. You're absolutely correct. And if you look at the major Washington media press organizations, the Washington Post and the Atlantic, this is precisely what's going on. It's not just political partisanship. These are platforms for oligarchs, tech oligarchs.
Again, I want to thank all the witnesses for just what you do in your careers. You know, what you've contributed to our republic, and as Benjamin Franklin so famously said, it's republic if we can keep it. And it's a real concern when we see what's happening here. You know, the abuse of power. I'm highly concerned.